There's something about cabins in the woods, isolated, silent, surrounded by endless trees, that makes them the perfect setting for our darkest fears. Tonight, we're diving into 9 chilling cabin tales from deep in the forest. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. What starts as a peaceful getaway can quickly turn into a waking nightmare. So get comfortable, but not too comfortable. The woods are alive with secrets, and they're listening. Hannah thought she knew what solitude felt like. She had spent years chasing peace. Those rare moments where the world around her fell silent, leaving only her thoughts to echo in the stillness. But this time, peace was replaced with something she couldn't name, something darker. It started with the window. This is a tale of isolation, terror, and the gnawing question, when you're truly alone, are you ever safe? Hannah loved solo trips, the kind that pulled her away from the noise of her city life. She was a writer by trade, working on a deadline for a thriller novel she hadn't even started. She told herself that this weekend would be the cure for her creative drought. A friend had recommended a small, remote cabin in the woods, tucked far away from the nearest town. It had everything she needed: a fireplace, a cozy bed, and no Wi-Fi. Perfect for focusing on her work. She arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. The trees around the cabin swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under her tires. It felt idyllic. The cabin itself was rustic but charming. A wraparound porch with an old rocking chair, big windows that let the sunlight stream in, and a woodsy smell that made it feel like stepping back in time. Hannah unpacked, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the small wooden desk in the corner. She stared at her blank laptop screen, then out the window at the dense forest beyond. It was beautiful, but something about the trees unsettled her. They seemed to press in, as if the cabin was being watched. That evening, Hannah cooked a simple dinner and settled by the fireplace with her notebook. She jotted down plot ideas, losing herself in the crackling warmth of the flames. The hours slipped by, and the forest outside grew darker and darker until it was nothing but an impenetrable black void. At around midnight, she decided to call it a night. As she moved to close the curtains, she paused. Her reflection stared back at her, but something felt off. Was there a shape in the darkness? She squinted, but it was gone before she could focus. Hannah shook her head, laughing at her own paranoia. She locked the front door, double-checked the windows, and climbed into bed. A soft knock woke her in the middle of the night. She blinked, her heart pounding as she strained to hear it again. It was faint, but unmistakable, a gentle tap, tap, tap against the window. Her first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a branch, brushing against the glass. She got up and hesitated by the bedroom window, her breath fogging the glass. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The forest outside was still. No movement, no sound. Hannah sighed and climbed back into bed. She told herself it was just the wind, but as she drifted off, the knocking came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. By morning, Hannah felt silly. Whatever had knocked at the window was gone, and daylight made the cabin feel safe again. She spent the day hiking the nearby trails, breathing in the fresh air and snapping photos, but that sense of unease crept back as the sun began to set. She made sure every door and window was locked before starting a fire. The knocking returned just after dark. This time it wasn't at her bedroom window. It was the large window in the living room facing the porch. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Hannah's hands shook as she grabbed her phone. No service. Of course. She debated grabbing a flashlight and checking outside, but fear kept her rooted in place. Instead, she stood a few feet from the window, squinting into the blackness. The porch light cast a weak glow, but beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. She couldn't see anything out there. She whispered to herself, "It's just an animal." But deep down, she knew better. Around midnight, the knocking stopped, but Hannah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin set her nerves on edge. As she stared at the bedroom ceiling, she heard it again, not knocking this time, but a faint scratching sound, as if something was dragging across the walls. Her heart thudded in her chest. She got out of bed, grabbing the fireplace poker as a makeshift weapon. Slowly, she moved to the living room. That's when she saw it. A shape, faint but unmistakable, standing just outside the window. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. She froze. The figure didn't look like an animal. It was tall, its shoulders hunched unnaturally, its head tilted slightly to the side. Gathering all her courage, she yelled, "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Then, without warning, it turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the trees. Hannah didn't sleep at all. By dawn, she decided to leave. She packed her things quickly, but as she approached the car, she noticed something strange. Footprints in the dirt leading from the forest to the cabin, and then back again. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That a shadowy figure stood outside her window. Still, she convinced herself to stay. Maybe it was a local playing a prank. But that night, the knocking came back, this time at the back door. Tap, tap, tap. Hannah grabbed her flashlight and swung the back door open, her poker at the ready. The light illuminated the empty porch, but something moved in the trees. She stepped outside, her heart pounding, scanning the woods. That's when she saw it, the same figure, closer now, its head still tilted. It stepped into the light, revealing its face. It wasn't human. Its eyes were sunken, its skin pale and stretched too tight, its mouth curled into a grimace. It took one step toward her. Hannah screamed, slamming the door and locking it. For hours, she sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the poker as the knocking continued, louder and louder. Then, just before dawn, it stopped. When the sun rose, Hannah finally worked up the courage to leave. She didn't pack her things, she just got in her car and drove. But as she turned onto the main road, she glanced in her rearview mirror. There, in the back seat, was a faint outline of a handprint on the foggy glass. Some stories don't have a clean ending. Hannah escaped the cabin, but she'll never escape what she saw. What would you have done in her shoes? Let me know in the comments below. Hannah thought she knew what solitude felt like. She had spent years chasing peace. Those rare moments where the world around her fell silent, leaving only her thoughts to echo in the stillness. But this time, peace was replaced with something she couldn't name, something darker. It started with the window. This is a tale of isolation, terror, and the gnawing question, when you're truly alone, are you ever safe? Hannah loved solo trips, the kind that pulled her away from the noise of her city life. She was a writer by trade, working on a deadline for a thriller novel she hadn't even started. She told herself that this weekend would be the cure for her creative drought. A friend had recommended a small, remote cabin in the woods, tucked far away from the nearest town. It had everything she needed, a fireplace, a cozy bed, and no Wi-Fi. Perfect for focusing on her work. She arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon. The trees around the cabin swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under her tires. It felt idyllic. The cabin itself was rustic but charming. A wraparound porch with an old rocking chair, big windows that let the sunlight stream in, and a woodsy smell that made it feel like stepping back in time. Hannah unpacked, made a cup of coffee, and sat at the small wooden desk in the corner. She stared at her blank laptop screen, then out the window at the dense forest beyond. It was beautiful, but something about the trees unsettled her. They seemed to press in, as if the cabin was being watched. That evening, Hannah cooked a simple dinner and settled by the fireplace with her notebook. She jotted down plot ideas, losing herself in the crackling warmth of the flames. The hours slipped by, and the forest outside grew darker and darker until it was nothing but an impenetrable black void. At around midnight, she decided to call it a night. As she moved to close the curtains, she paused. Her reflection stared back at her, but something felt off. Was there a shape in the darkness? She squinted, but it was gone before she could focus. Hannah shook her head, laughing at her own paranoia. She locked the front door, double-checked the windows and climbed into bed. A soft knock woke her in the middle of the night. She blinked, her heart pounding as she strained to hear it again. It was faint, but unmistakable, a gentle tap, tap, tap against the window. Her first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a branch, brushing against the glass. She got up and hesitated by the bedroom window, her breath fogging the glass. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The forest outside was still. No movement, no sound. Hannah sighed and climbed back into bed. She told herself it was just the wind, but as she drifted off, the knocking came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. By morning, Hannah felt silly. Whatever had knocked at the window was gone, and daylight made the cabin feel safe again. She spent the day hiking the nearby trails, breathing in the fresh air and snapping photos, but that sense of unease crept back as the sun began to set. She made sure every door and window was locked before starting a fire. The knocking returned just after dark. This time it wasn't at her bedroom window. It was the large window in the living room facing the porch. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic. Tap, tap, tap. Hannah's hands shook as she grabbed her phone. No service. Of course. She debated grabbing a flashlight and checking outside, but fear kept her rooted in place. Instead, she stood a few feet from the window, squinting into the blackness. The porch light cast a weak glow, but beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. She couldn't see anything out there. She whispered to herself, "It's just an animal." But deep down, she knew better. Around midnight, the knocking stopped, but Hannah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin set her nerves on edge. As she stared at the bedroom ceiling, she heard it again. Not knocking this time, but a faint scratching sound, as if something was dragging across the walls. "It's not the wind," Logan said firmly. The hum was constant, unchanging, as if it was coming from all directions at once. Then, without warning, it stopped. They exchanged uneasy glances, the silence now even more oppressive than before. "Let's just call it a night," Mia suggested. "We'll laugh about this tomorrow." Reluctantly, they put out the fire and headed inside. Logan woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound, faint footsteps just outside the cabin. At first, he thought it was one of his friends, but then he remembered the creaky porch and the steps were too light, too deliberate. He held his breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft tapping at the window near the front door. "Josh?" Logan whispered, but there was no response. Gathering his courage, he crept to the living room and peeked out the window. A shadowy figure stood on the porch, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at the door. Logan's heart pounded. He backed away, nearly tripping over a chair, and ran to wake the others. Logan's panic woke Josh and Mia. He quickly explained what he'd seen, but when they checked the porch, it was empty. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" Josh asked, though his tone lacked conviction. Logan glared at him. "I know what I saw." Mia rubbed her arms, glancing nervously at the windows. "I don't like this. Maybe we should leave." "It's the middle of the night," Josh said, "and we're miles from anywhere. Let's just stay inside, okay? We'll figure it out in the morning." Reluctantly, they agreed. They barricaded the doors and windows with furniture and sat in the living room, too wired to sleep. As the hours dragged on, the hum returned. It was louder this time, rattling the windows and making the floor vibrate. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the hum, but soon they grew louder, overlapping and echoing, as if dozens of voices were speaking at once. "What are they saying?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Logan shook his head. "I don't know. It doesn't sound like English." The whispers seemed to come from outside, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Josh grabbed a flashlight and pointed it out the window. The beam illuminated the edge of the forest, but there was nothing there. "Guys, we're leaving," Logan said. his voice firm. "No arguments here," Mia replied. They grabbed their bags and bolted for the car, the hum and whispers growing louder with every step. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at their clothes as they ran. When they reached the car, Josh fumbled with the keys, dropping them in his panic. Logan snatched them up, unlocking the doors as the whispers grew deafening. They piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the cabin porch light flickered and died. As they sped down the dirt road, Mia glanced back and screamed. In the rearview mirror, Logan saw it too. A figure standing in the middle of the road, watching them leave. Its head tilted unnaturally, its shadow stretching impossibly long in the moonlight. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. None of them spoke about what had happened, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Weeks later, Logan tried to find the listing for the cabin online, but it was gone. When he searched the forum, he found a single post about the area. "Don't go to the cabin by the lake. The forest doesn't want you there." Some places are better left untouched. The forest remembers, and it doesn't forget trespassers. If you've ever experienced something you can't explain, share it in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed these tales. There's a saying that some doors are meant to stay closed, but what happens when curiosity wins and you open one that shouldn't be opened? Mara and Dylan thought their weekend getaway in a remote cabin was going to be nothing more than a peaceful retreat. What they didn't know was that the cabin had a secret, a locked room that held a chilling truth. Mara and Dylan had been together for 5 years. They weren't the kind of couple who needed big, extravagant trips to enjoy each other's company. A quiet weekend in a secluded cabin was enough. Dylan had found the rental online. It was cheap, charming, and just far enough away to make them feel like they'd left the world behind. The description had been simple: cozy cabin in the woods, perfect for couples. No Wi-Fi, no distractions. When they arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. A small, rustic home with a wooden porch, nestled in the heart of a dense forest. It was the kind of place where the only sounds were birdsong and the rustle of leaves. But as they unpacked, Mara noticed something strange. One of the doors inside the cabin was padlocked. "Must be a storage room," Dylan said when Mara pointed it out. "Why would they lock it?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "It's not like we'd mess with their stuff." Dylan shrugged. "Maybe it's dangerous. Old wiring or tools they don't want guests messing with." Mara nodded but couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the door gave her. It was different from the rest of the cabin, newer, reinforced, like it was built to keep something in, not out. The first night passed without incident. They cooked dinner, played cards by the fire, and laughed about their terrible attempts at ghost stories. By the time they went to bed, Mara had almost forgotten about the door. Almost. Around 2 a.m., Mara woke to a faint noise. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she listened, she realized it was coming from inside the cabin. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like scratching. She nudged Dylan. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" "That noise," she whispered. "It's coming from the locked room." Dylan sat up, frowning. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. "Probably a mouse," he said, but his voice lacked confidence. Mara didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate. "Go back to sleep," Dylan muttered, pulling the blanket over his head. But Mara stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with every scratch. By morning, the noise had stopped, and Dylan laughed off Mara's concerns. "Cabins like this are bound to have critters," he said, sipping his coffee. But Mara wasn't convinced. She spent the day exploring the cabin, trying to distract herself. She even went for a walk in the woods while Dylan chopped firewood. When she returned, she found Dylan standing in front of the locked door, a crowbar in hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Look, I know it's bothering you," he said. "I figured if I just opened it, you'd see there's nothing to worry about." Mara hesitated, torn between relief and fear. "And if the owner finds out?" "We'll lock it back up," Dylan said with a grin. "They'll never know." Reluctantly, Mara agreed. Dylan wedged the crowbar under the padlock and gave it a sharp tug. The lock popped open with a metallic clang, and the door creaked ajar. Inside was a small dark room with a single rocking chair in the center. The walls were bare, except for deep scratches etched into the wood. "What the hell?" Dylan muttered, stepping inside. Mara followed, her stomach twisting. The air in the room felt colder, heavier. "Look at this," Dylan said, pointing to the floor. The wood was worn, as if something had been dragged repeatedly across it. But what unnerved Mara the most was the chair. It was angled slightly, as if someone had been sitting there watching the door. That night, Mara couldn't stop thinking about the room. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Dylan slept soundly beside her. Around midnight, she heard it again, the scratching. She sat up, her heart racing. The sound was coming from the locked room, but now it was louder, more frantic. "Dylan," she whispered, shaking him awake. "What now?" he groaned. "The noise, it's back." Dylan sighed and got out of bed. He grabbed the flashlight and headed to the locked room, Mara following close behind. The door was still ajar, just as they had left it, but as Dylan shone the flashlight inside, they both froze. The rocking chair was moving, it swayed back and forth slowly, the rhythmic creak filling the room. "Wind," Dylan said, his voice shaky. "It's just the wind." But there was no breeze. The next day, Mara wanted to leave, but Dylan convinced her to stay. "We've come this far," he said. "Let's not let a creepy chair ruin our trip." Reluctantly, she agreed. That night, the noises grew worse. Not just scratching, but whispers, faint, overlapping voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Mara covered her ears, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Do you hear that?" she asked Dylan, tears streaming down her face. He nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the room." Unable to take it anymore, Dylan grabbed the crowbar and stormed into the locked room. "Whatever's in here, I'm ending this," he said. But as soon as he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. "Dylan!" Mara screamed, pounding on the door. Inside, Dylan's flashlight flickered, illuminating the scratches on the walls. The whispers turned into screams, and the rocking chair began to move violently, slamming against the floor. Suddenly, everything went silent. The door creaked open, and Mara stepped inside, trembling. Dylan was gone. The room was empty, except for the chair, which was now perfectly still. Mara called the police, but they found no sign of Dylan. The owner of the cabin claimed to know nothing about the locked room. Months later, Mara returned to the cabin, desperate for answers. She found the room exactly as it had been, the scratches, the chair, the heavy silence, and on the floor, carved into the wood, were the words, "I'm still here." Some doors are locked for a reason. Mara learned that the hard way. But the question remains, what happened to Dylan? Was he taken by something, or was he lost in the silence of the locked room forever? If you have a theory, share it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. When you're deep in the woods, miles from the nearest sign of life, you realize how small you really are. The trees seem endless, the shadows stretch forever, and time itself feels like it slows down. For Liam, what started as a peaceful solo hike turned into something much darker when he found an old cabin with a journal that should have stayed buried. This is a story of curiosity, isolation, and the chilling truth that some things are better left undiscovered. Liam was an experienced hiker. He loved the solitude of the outdoors, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the modern world. His friends often teased him about his adventures, saying he'd end up as one of those mysterious disappearances they read about online. This particular hike was one he'd been planning for months, a 3-day trek deep into a national forest, far from any marked trails. He packed light but smart, water purification tablets, a sturdy tent, and a satellite phone for emergencies. On the second day, he stumbled upon something unexpected. The trail had been narrow and overgrown, the kind of path that suggested it hadn't been used in years. As he pushed through the underbrush, he saw it, a small, weathered cabin, hidden among the trees. The cabin was old, so old it looked like it might collapse under its own weight. The roof sagged, the wooden planks were warped and moss-covered, and the windows were cracked. Curiosity got the better of him. He stepped onto the creaking porch, noticing the eerie silence that surrounded the place. The usual sounds of the forest, birdsong, rustling leaves, had vanished. The door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" Liam called out, though he doubted anyone would answer. The cabin looked abandoned. When no one responded, he pushed the door open. The interior was sparse, a dusty table with one broken chair, a rusted stove, and a pile of firewood in the corner. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but something else lingered, a faint metallic tang, like blood. On the table was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. Liam hesitated before picking it up. Something about it felt wrong, but his curiosity overpowered his unease. The first few pages were unreadable, the ink smudged and faded, but as he flipped further, the words became clearer, and what he read made his stomach tighten. The first legible entry was dated nearly 50 years ago. It described the cabin as a hunting lodge built by two brothers who wanted to live off the land. But as Liam read on, the tone shifted. "Something is wrong here," one entry read. "At night, I hear voices coming from the woods. They call my name, but when I step outside, there's no one there." Another entry. "The animals avoid this place. Even the birds don't sing near the cabin anymore. I feel like I'm being watched, but every time I look out the window, the forest is still." The final entry made Liam's blood run cold. "If you're reading this, it's already too late. Don't stay here. Don't trust the forest. It doesn't want you to leave." Liam's initial reaction was to laugh it off. It was just a story, he told himself, probably written by someone who went a little stir-crazy, living in isolation. Still, the journal left him uneasy. He decided to set up camp a short distance from the cabin, not wanting to spend the night inside. As he lay in his tent, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. Around midnight, he woke to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, circling his campsite. He held his breath, clutching the knife he kept by his side. "Who's there?" he called out. The footsteps stopped. He waited, his heart pounding, but no one answered. The next morning, Liam packed up and decided to leave the area, but as he retraced his steps, he noticed something strange. The trail that had led him to the cabin now seemed different. The trees were denser, the path narrower, and the landmarks he remembered were gone. He pulled out his map and compass, but no matter how carefully he navigated, he couldn't find his way back to his original route. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself. By midday, he was back at the cabin. Frustrated and exhausted, Liam decided to spend another night near the cabin. He built a fire and tried to calm his nerves, convincing himself that he'd find his way in the morning. But as darkness fell, the strange noises began again. Footsteps, whispers, and something else. A low, guttural hum, like the growl of a distant predator. Liam stared into the forest, the firelight flickering across his face. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, forming shapes that vanished as soon as he focused on them. And then he saw it, a figure barely visible standing at the edge of the firelight. "Who are you?" Liam demanded, grabbing his knife. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Terrified, Liam threw a burning branch toward it. The figure vanished, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. Desperate for answers, Liam returned to the journal. He flipped through the remaining pages, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. One entry stood out. "There's something beneath the cabin. I hear it at night, scratching at the floorboards. It wants out." Liam looked down. The floorboards were warped and uneven, as if something had pushed against them from below. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his knife and began prying at the boards. They came loose with surprising ease, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space. The smell hit him first, a mix of rot and damp earth. He shone his flashlight inside and saw something glinting in the dirt. A pile of bones. Liam stumbled back, his mind racing. The journal hadn't been a warning, it had been a record of what had happened to the brothers, and now it was happening to him. The hum returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows in the forest grew darker, thicker, as if they were alive. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut and the fire outside extinguished. Liam was plunged into darkness. He ran, his flashlight swinging wildly, but the forest seemed to close in around him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. And then, silence. Liam woke up at the edge of the forest, his gear scattered around him. He had no memory of how he got there. The journal was gone, and when he tried to find the cabin again, it was as if it had never existed. Months later, he shared his story on an online forum, hoping someone might have an explanation. One reply stood out: "The cabin finds you when it wants to, and if it lets you go, consider yourself lucky." Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Liam learned that the hard way. The forest keeps its secrets, and those who try to uncover them may never escape. What do you think happened to Liam? Share your theories in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We all rely on maps, apps, and GPS to keep us on track, but what if they led you somewhere you weren't meant to go? Emma and Jake's road trip was supposed to be about making memories, not nightmares. But one wrong turn into the woods brought them face to face with something they couldn't explain and couldn't escape. This is a story about the dangers of curiosity, the shadows that watch from the trees, and the horror of realizing you've gone too far to turn back. Emma and Jake had been planning their road trip for months. As siblings, they didn't always see eye to eye, but they both loved exploring new places and taking the scenic route whenever possible. Their plan was simple: drive through the countryside, stop at roadside diners, and take plenty of detours to discover hidden gems. They'd packed their car with snacks, maps, and a playlist they could both agree on, a minor miracle in itself. Everything was going perfectly until their second day on the road. They'd been driving for hours, winding through picturesque back roads, when Jake suggested taking a shortcut. "It'll save us at least an hour," he said, holding up his phone. Emma glanced at the screen. The route looked fine, a straight shot through a wooded area, with plenty of time to reach their next stop before nightfall. "Let's do it," she said. Neither of them could have known what waited for them in the woods. At first, the road seemed like any other back road, narrow, surrounded by dense trees, but peaceful. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns on the pavement. Emma even rolled down her window to enjoy the fresh air. "This isn't so bad," she said. "Way better than the highway." Jake nodded, fiddling with the radio. "Told you, trust the shortcut master." But as they drove deeper into the woods, the road began to change. The pavement turned to gravel and the trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. Jake's phone beeped. "Lost signal," he said, frowning. Emma glanced at her own phone. No bars. "It's fine," Jake said quickly. "The road's still here. We'll be out of the woods in no time." But the road was narrowing, the gravel crunching louder under the tires. Emma started to feel uneasy. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked. Jake hesitated. "Yeah, I think so." After another half hour of driving, the road seemed to end abruptly, transitioning into a dirt path barely wide enough for the car. Jake stopped the car, squinting at the trail ahead. "That can't be right," he muttered. Emma sighed. "Great, now what?" Jake opened his phone, but the map wouldn't load. "Let's just keep going a little further," he said. "There's got to be a way out." Reluctantly, Emma agreed, but as they bumped along the dirt path, the trees grew even denser, their branches scraping against the car like fingers, and then they saw it. A cabin, partially hidden behind a curtain of moss and vines. "Maybe someone there can help us," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Emma frowned. "I don't know. It doesn't look safe." But Jake was already getting out of the car. The cabin was old, too old. The wood was warped and rotting, the windows cracked and smeared with grime. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that made Emma's skin crawl. "Hello?" Jake called out, stepping onto the porch. Emma stayed by the car, her arms crossed. "This is a bad idea," she muttered under her breath. Jake tried the door. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark interior. The air smelled musty, like damp earth and decay. "Hello?" Jake called again, louder this time. No response. But as Jake stepped inside, Emma noticed something strange. Claw marks on the doorframe, deep and jagged, as if something had tried to force its way in or out. "Jake," she said sharply, "let's go." But Jake was already inside. The cabin was empty, but it didn't feel abandoned. A layer of dust covered the furniture, but the air felt heavy, charged, as if someone or something had been there recently. Jake wandered through the small space, examining the tattered curtains and broken chairs. "This place is creepy," he admitted, his voice echoing. Emma stepped inside reluctantly, keeping close to the door. Her eyes were drawn to a large fireplace on the far wall. Above it, something was scrawled in dark, smeared letters. "Don't stay after dark." Emma's stomach tightened. "Jake, we need to leave. Now." Jake nodded. But as they turned to leave, a sound stopped them in their tracks. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere outside the cabin. Emma froze, her heart racing. What was that? Jake peered out the grimy window, his face pale. "I don't know. Probably an animal." But the growl came again, louder this time, closer. Emma grabbed Jake's arm. "We're leaving, right now!" They hurried back to the car, but as they approached, Emma stopped dead in her tracks. The tires were slashed. Deep, jagged gashes ran along the rubber, and the car leaned awkwardly on its rims. "What the—" Jake started, but Emma cut him off. "Get in the car," she said, her voice trembling. "We'll figure it out later." As they sat in the car, trying to calm their racing hearts, the woods around them grew unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of nature, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, had vanished. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs and a head that tilted unnaturally to one side. "Is that a person?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't answer. He was too busy fumbling with the keys, trying to start the car despite the ruined tires. The figure stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its pale face barely visible in the dim light. And then it smiled. Jake finally got the car started, the engine roaring to life. "Hold on," he said, slamming the gear into reverse. The car lurched backward, metal grinding against the dirt path as the shredded tires struggled to move. The figure didn't move at first, but as the car gained momentum, it started walking, then running toward them. Emma screamed as the figure closed the distance, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked by invisible strings. The car broke free from the dirt path and onto the gravel road, but the figure didn't stop. It chased them, keeping pace despite the car's speed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the tree line and onto a paved road. The figure stopped abruptly, retreating into the shadows. They didn't stop driving until they reached the nearest town. Shaken and exhausted, they told a local sheriff what had happened, but he just frowned. "There's no cabin in those woods," he said. "Not anymore. It burned down years ago." Emma and Jake insisted, but the sheriff's expression didn't change. "You're not the first to say you've seen something out there," he admitted finally. "But my advice? Don't go back." They didn't. But they'll never forget the figure that chased them, or the chilling smile that told them they'd made a mistake they could never take back. Sometimes the wrong turn can take you to the right place, unless that place is somewhere you were never meant to find. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Emma and Jake's shoes?